Welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. Storytelling is what connects us as humans, and for brands, it is no different. A well-told story can effectively position your brand in the minds and hearts of your audience, and can convert thoughts and feelings into results and revenue. On this show, we dive into the unique and recurring principles of world-class storytellers from every walk of life to help you level up your storytelling skills and knowledge to drive real, measurable results for you and your organization. Here's your host, Paul Furlong.
Hello and welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. I'm Paul Furlong, Creative Director of Opus Media, and today's guest is Suse Weisse. Suse teaches the art of storytelling at the Free University of Berlin, as well as at the Berlin University of the Arts. She is a co-founder of the narrative theatre ensemble FabulaDrama in Berlin and has received many awards as the narrator and has often been invited to international festivals. She has developed a special form of multilingual narration on the stage and is co-founder of the multilingual narrative theatre series Fenster zum Welt. Well, Suse, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming along today.
Hi.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, expanding on what I've just talked about, and maybe telling us how story involves itself in your world?
It was very typical. When I was a child, my grandmother would tell me stories, but mostly stories of her life. The stories I'm telling today, mostly, she read to me in books, but she told me stories from her life. When I was a child, I wanted to hear about what life was like when she was a child, for example, and she told me a lot about World War I and World War II and so on. So I was used to being told stories, but I started storytelling much, much later, and there was a big period in my life when stories were like only in cinema or in books important to me. And during my studies of theater pedagogues or like drama teacher in University of Arts, we were working on traditional stories and working on that you usually use them for theater with children and so on. And then we were like considering what would it be like to give them back to the oral tradition instead of making theater plays from them, from like traditional folk tales and fairy tales. So we developed it more and more. And that started like in 1999. I started to found this group, FabulaDrama. And I didn't found it. I was one of the members. It was Professor Christine Wadecki from University of Arts who did it with some alumni. So we were a group of 6 and we started once a week to really just work about stories, to try to tell them together or alone, to like this, And then we started also to tell stories in public. It started by a volunteer thing, and then there were librarians who said, "Oh, please, could you come into my library?" And so around Berlin, this started, and we thought we were pioneers, but we weren't, of course. I mean, in all over the world, and especially in Britain, for example, and France, storytelling had never really stopped, but it had gone down, but there was kind of a revival of it in the 80s already in schools and so on, so we were late. And then we found out that also in West Germany and the south of Germany, there were already storytellers doing storytelling for many years. And nevertheless, there was a big growing through the University of Arts and Christine Wadecki, because she really started as a part of the studies of drama teaching. She started to really make people interested for storytelling and educate them. In the beginning, it was only a little, and then it grew more and more. And I think ever since we have trained so many storytellers, and there is such a lot storytelling nowadays in Berlin, in schools and school projects, which are financed by the state and so on. So in the last, you can say, nearly 20 years, there has been a big development of that. And me, well, I was a drama teacher, I was a psychologist, I was a social worker, social pedagogue, and then I started drama teaching, and I became a storyteller by coincidence. And I found out that this is what I want to do, that it's like being your own director, being always improvising on stage, very important. I like to act as well, but it was never easy for me because I really like to be improvising. And then if you act or play, you cannot improvise all the time, at least not if you're more people than one on stage. And storytelling is so different from that. It's as a storyteller, I feel I'm not so much important. The more important thing is always the story. I give my face, I give my gestures, I give my body, I give my voice, but I feel that I'm like lending all these things to the story. The story comes to me, goes through me, I give it to the audience, and I can see on their faces and in their eyes that there is something origin coming to the people through that story. So in every face there is something different. Also, I can see something happens throughout the story, and that's not me. That's the story, and that's the history of stories. It's about centuries of storytelling who have washed this story like a stone in the river, and now it's there, and I pass it on, and it's getting washed on and on again. This is how stories are to me. They connect me to our ancestors.
And that's all within the oral tradition. Does Germany have a strong storytelling oral tradition going back many, many centuries?
I think yes, of course, but it was like it was interrupted through the development of civilization, through industrialization, through the media who came in, and I think mostly interrupted completely, or it came nearly to a complete end with the Second World War, with fascism, and not through the fascism, but afterwards, because people just stopped talking. I mean, they wouldn't talk about what they experienced during the war and before. And so they wouldn't pass on stories either, because I think this is very connected. Storytelling and passing on your own experiences it's two sides of the same coin, and since people wouldn't talk about their traumata and not about their guilt and not, so they wouldn't pass on stories. So it's very hard to tell a story if you don't want to remember your life. So it came nearly to a breakdown, and it started again in the late 80s, I think. Yeah. And
obviously Germany is famous for its kind of written storytelling tradition with the Brothers Grimm, and you mentioned them earlier on. So what is it about Germany that lends itself so easily to fairy tales, and why do you think that the Brothers Grimm were so good at?
Well, most of it, they were scientists. They were language and literature scientists, you could say, and they were very interested in collecting these kind of tales. But if you look at those different editions they printed, they had printed, in the beginning, they were very short tales. They were they worked on them, but very little, and then the next prints they published, they were more elaborated each time, and in the end, the stories as we have them now, they have never been told that way. It's a poet's work on them, it's a literature work. It's not about oral tradition. So it's very hard nowadays to say what were the stories they really got. If you get, there is a tiny book of prints of the first notes they put when they heard the stories. And this gives an idea to what it was before, you know. And then you can find also that what they got as stories is partly very French, because it came from Huguenot people who had to leave France and brought stories, which are Perrault stories, or kind of. And then, of course, you find stories in the Grimm collection, which is which are connected very much to stories you find everywhere in the world, you know. And they just came through the Orient, I think, to Germany as well as to any other part of Europe. So there is nothing very special about the Grimm stories. They made them special because they put them down, they made a big collection, and because of their special way of giving them their poet stamp, profile, you know. So then they were read to children a lot, although they are not children's literature. But since they printed them as a children and house book, they were read to children, but most of them is not children's stuff, I would say. It's stories about love and crime, or sex and crime, you could say, as they have been told and told and told and told between adults, and as they are told today between adults. I mean, if you look the crime novels, if you look the cinema, it's always about that, you know, love and hate, yeah, and betrayal, and that mostly the good will survive in the end.
And so what do you think the importance of fairy tales are?
First of it, the importance is that I think the most important message of fairy tales is that it's always good if you are in a bad situation. There's always help once you start to talk about it. Usually the turning point in the fairy tale is when the hero, he or she, sits down and cries. And then when she starts to cry, there's always coming up someone. Could be an animal, could be a dwarf, could be whatever, you know, asking, why do you cry? And then she or he tells what he's suffering about. And then there is a new, you can walk a new way, you know. Then there is this opportunity to say, listen, if you go that way, you will find, and then, you know, and then the adventure starts. And during this adventure, usually the hero is growing over himself or herself. And then in the end, there is a solution he or she would never have dreamt of. So this is what the first thing is. Fairy tales give a lot of hope that life is unforeseeable, and that if you believe in this possibility, they will always open a way. First. The next thing is fairy tales tell me to believe and wonder that everything is possible. And they teach me to believe in good and evil, to believe that evil things can be overcome. And it's not about moral, you know. Fairy tales are not about moral. The only moral in fairy tale is that you should believe and wonder and believe in the good, I think. The rest, if there is moral in it, then it comes from authors like the Grimm, or usually the fairy tale is only offering itself. And it's very interesting if you talk, for example, to children or to people about the stories afterwards, they don't get all the same message. There is no one message in the story. But I think there is one general message, which is that life has to be supported. You know, life is something you have to try to to really schützen, protect life in form of animals, in form of hungry people, in form of your own hungry belly, you know. You have to trust in life and to have to protect life as your surrounding, but environment, everything. Everything is part of living world. Yes. In fairy tales, animals can speak, tables can speak. I mean, you know, everything is alive and has to be protected to carry on life.
Now, one of the things that you study and one of the things that you teach is about how stories can help in learning languages, both for children and for adults. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's something we discovered some years ago, that like 10, it was in the beginning of the millennium. We somehow discovered that although the fairy tales usually are told in a quite elaborated, in a linguistic way of talking code, you know, quite educated language I use for telling them, not antiquated, but quite elaborated. Anyway, those who are still beginning to learn language, they learn a lot. And we found that this is maybe because all the stories belong to the whole world. So it's very easy to connect to the pattern a story is told in, because that's like a global pattern of stories, you know. So for someone from Persia, from Afghanistan, or someone from Syria who wouldn't know so much German, he knows the pattern. And so when I tell them stories, I tell the stories with my voice, with my face, with my body language, but also with the blackboard behind. And if there are words they wouldn't understand too easy in the beginning, I just draw very easy, like the story starts in a house, I put a house, you know, then there is this long way through the forest, I make a way and I put the forest, and then I'm in the castle or the cavern with the dragon or whatever, you know, and it's only very little drawing, but then they have the whole pattern here, and I can show to say, now the boy is there in the forest and there, and they easily see, you know, the scenography. Sometimes I work with kamishibai, which is, do you know kamishibai? It's like a little frame, like the telly, you know, like a little telly frame, and you have just different drawings in it, and you have to, the actual drawing is in front, and when he leaves the forest, I take it out, and there is the next picture. When I was a child, we used to have those little tellies you could look into and give it a switch, and then the picture would turn and turn and turn. It's like that. But I prefer the blackboard because this is life, you know. It's life that I do a drawing, and I can always change the story if I want, you know. If I'm with the kamishibai, I stick to the pictures, you know. So I prefer the blackboard. And then they easily learn, and quite often, for example, those pupils, we have those classes in Germany where young pupils come to learn only German. You know, they are from 15 years on, they come from everywhere. And afterwards I talk to them, and quite often they know the story from their homes. It's different, but they know the motives, they have heard it already, or not quite that, but they recognize some of the patterns. So that makes it easy.
What universal elements do you find are in all the stories that people will know from around the world?
It's the pattern that someone in the beginning, the hero, has to leave wherever he is, you know. He has to leave home because it's burned down, or because his parents died, or because he was nothing to inherit because he was the youngest one, whatever. And then he's on his way, and there is a big crisis. And then during this crisis, he finds someone to help him, but he has also to give something. His courage, he has, or he has to, it's always three chances, he has to try 3 times, and only the 3rd time he will be successful. There is bad witches in forests, there is bad dragons. There can be a good dragon if it's Asian, but usually it's bad ones. He has to prove, or she has to prove herself. And in the end, there is a solution to free a prince or a princess, or they are put into a barrel and put out into the wild sea, but then he has some magic words, and he makes that they get onto an island, and that on that island there is a castle, and they can get into whatever, these breaks, and just a new possibility shows up, and that's what they know from everywhere. And then, of course, in the villages are different. The German village looks different. There's houses of stones and not of straw. There is no desert in German. In German stories, there is the wood, and in Asian stories, there is a lot of grass. Like the tundra, or then in African stories, there's a lot of desert. In the North African stories, there's a lot of desert, and so on. So the images are different, but the patterns of what happens in stories is very alike. So if they understand the stories, they say, I know a story, but he's not walking through a forest. He is, and then comes the specific items of their stories. Yeah.
So in your biography, that I read about you, you wrote something, and I wondered if I could read it back to you and you could expand on it a little bit. It kind of carries on from what we've just been talking about. So you wrote, storytelling generally conveys human values and norms, addresses existential human themes, and links us with our cultural roots. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, when I tell stories to a group of whoever, I can feel that I get really connected to them, because the story I give them is gone through my whole body. To my whole association, remembrance, my own history, my own experiences. So all this together forms the story I heard. And when I give them to other people, I tell them to other people, the story is new. She's renewed through my own experiences. And then I can see, how I told you in the beginning, I can see that the same thing happened when they get the story into their own minds, and then we are all together connected through this story. It's not me, I'm important, it's now them, and it's a story, and we feel connected because we all connect to the hero, to Ivan, or, we connect to his fate, and there is a lot of empathy. I think that the most important word maybe is empathy. Storytelling really, and listening to stories makes you develop empathy for others, and it's so important for a society to develop empathy. To be able to imagine what someone else feels in this or that moment. Storytelling really teaches you that, because you can feel it in the moment. I can see the feelings on the faces of the people when I tell, like there is fear on their faces, or hope, or there is being afraid, being shocked, or whatever, and also a lot of pity can be there if something bad or sad happens to the hero, So I can see that on the faces no matter if they're old or young, no matter if they are teenagers, it happens with everybody. So that's what I think is the main thing stories do. They make you feel empathy. In German school classes, like 7th, 8th year, I like to tell stories. They are so difficult, those kids, but I like to tell them stories. And there are a lot of Turkish and Arab kids. And then I talked to the teacher, and he said, well, they don't know about Jewish. They don't know that even those religions are so close, And so one day I went and I told them a story about a Jewish shoemaker. What's the name for shoemaker? I don't know. But, he worked on shoes. That was his handcraft. And he was the hero of the story, And he was really in danger getting through. I won't tell you a story, but it was really, he was close to getting cut off his head. And it was something very special Jewish about the story, the way he connected to his God and how he made sure that he would not get cut off his head, And it was in a way jokey, and at the same time wise, and at the same time he was so believing so much in his God, And everybody in the class was just favoring with him that he might get through it, And he was Jewish, So in the end, we talked about, were they aware that they were all the time giving their heart to the fate of a Jewish man, And they were not aware of it, but afterwards, And so I think this just helps to see that human being are human being, And it just helps to overcome all those racist and nationalist borders we have in our minds or we grow up with.
And so what tools do you employ when you're telling a story to draw out the empathy in the people who are listening to your stories?
I do. I try to just let the story speak for herself. I mean, I tell the story from my heart. I'm not so much... I don't work the stories too much with my body, I don't learn the story in the way of, then I do the house, and then I do the magician, and then. I improvise it in the moment, and I try not to be, what is the adjective for vanity?
Vain.
Aha, very easy. In German, it's eitel. I try not to be too vain, It's not about me, the story. If I pose with my body or with my voice or with my face, I just do it to make the story more clear and not to make it theater. Because I have learned that if it's too much called theater during the storytelling, the people afterwards will not remember the story. They just remember your poses and they say, it was nice when it was this and that, but they don't remember what it was about. So I try not to do too much. Only when there is a big audience, sometimes it's helpful to really be big, and then I do. And of course, anyway, I try to be there with my whole body and with my whole attention and concentration. And I sometimes had a hiccup, a migraine, when I started storytelling because I had to. Sometimes afterwards the migraine was gone because my concentration was so focused on the story, it could even help to the migraine. It's not always working, but sometimes I experienced, So I think it's a lot about concentration also, to be in the story and with the audience. You have to be there and to see whether it gets to them or not. And also if somebody is crying or somebody is really with another problem, you have to stop and focus on that problem to help this person in again. So, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier on that you've done a lot of training. You've trained a lot of storytellers in the past.
Yes.
So when you're training them, what practical things do you teach them?
For example, I teach, amongst many things, I'm talking so much about telling through the heart and so on. This is all very much, I want them to really understand the stories before they start to tell them. And means also to understand what does that story mean to me? Why did I pick that story? And it's not about that they have to be psychological discourse with me, but with themselves. They shall understand what does it mean to them. That's like the inner work on the story is very important. Then I work with them on understanding the dramaturgy of a story. And I'm understanding also how it can help you to understand the dramaturgy, to understand the story, and also to remember the story. So this is a kind of way how you can work on stories to really understand them and remember them. I make them draw like story books or storyboards, not a trick. It's a skill of how you can learn and understand a story. I make them with body language go through the story. I make them imagine very much about the scenography of the story, because even if you only tell little items of the scenography, you have to have the whole thing in your head or in your mind, even if you only talk about a little detail then. And then one of the specialties I teach is how to teach together, how to tell together, to be in tandem or in a group of 3 or 4 or more. And then because I like very much to do that, to tell in tandem is very funny. And then there is this bilingual or multilingual thing that you can tell a story in several languages without translating each other, because if you start to translate, you have one to say, once upon a time there was a lady and he had 2 kids and she loved one and the other one she hated, and one day, and then you said, bueno, era una vez, había una mujer, and start over it again, for the audience it's like this. It's not at all nice, and it keeps you from understanding the foreign language, because fact is that you can understand a lot in a foreign language, even if you don't know the stories. If you get some hints what it is about, that's why it works for language learning. It's easy. So I started together with a colleague from France many years ago, Nathalie Bondou. We started you start the story and I continue. And there is only very little things like double, very little thing. She can tell about the widow with the 2 girls, and she only loves one and the other one not, And I go on and say, one day, the younger sister was sent from her stepmother to the well in the garden, So all the information is there. It's not as detailed as it was for those who understand French. But they get, and so I can go on with the stories, and later on Natalie takes over again, and like this. And sometimes when it's very important, we talk just in one voice at the same time. She's French, I'm German. You can do that very dramatic. You can do that very, or when there are dialogues, it's very easy. One can do the question, and the other language is giving the answer. From the answer, the question. From the question and the face, the answer is given. Very easy. And so of course, you can't improvise these things. You have to prepare them. You have to know that you are in the same stories and so on. But it works quite well. And the group Window to the World, Fenster zur Welt, was founded in Turkey. When we were there on a Turkish festival, we had invented ourselves there, and there was only 3 Turkish speakers One was Azerbaijan, which is quite a Turkish dialect. And Nazlı and Ilhan were the Turkish speakers also. And the rest of us was German, me, English and Spanish, which I speak. And there was Carmela with Italian and German. And Stella with Greek and German. And we had no Turkish, but we were all the time telling stories, and the Turkish ones were just throwing Turkish words into, and the people, once we started to tell in the market, they followed us everywhere through a weekend, and they liked it. And then we said, all right, this works, so let's work on it to professionalize it. And since then, we have done quite a lot of gigs and nice things.
Sounds brilliant. I'm just aware of time, Suse, so I wonder if I could ask you 3 quick fire questions that we ask all of the people we talk to. So the first one is, who do you think of when you hear the word story, and why?
I think of Jack Lynch just now, because he's one of the brilliant storytellers I got to know during the last 10 years, and I learned a lot from him.
And why do you think about him when you hear the word story?
I was very impressed when I heard stories from him who were biographic stories as well as Irish stories. And I saw him, I know he's an actor, but I saw him telling in Aldenbiesen to about 300 pupils. And he was sitting on a chair, and he had a table beside with a glass of water, and he was just sitting and telling, and it worked.
Brilliant. I know that we'll be talking to Jack actually in a couple of weeks, so I'm really looking forward to speaking to him, so I'm glad that you've said him. Can you recommend any good books or blogs or websites about storytelling?
Yes, I have some very, very good story collections from in English. I got from a New York press. I think it's Pantheon called. My best collections are from there. Then there is Anne Taylor as well. She's British, I think. I love, of course, Duncan Williamson's stories from the Traveller Stories, Scottish. Eddie from Ireland, he's great. He collected stories from the people who told about their experiences with the tiny folk, with the other world. I love stories from all over the world, and I prefer in my homeland the stories from the north, which are in the northern dialect. They are quite similar to Celtic stories. There is a lot of connection.
And finally then, Suse, where can we find out more about you? How can we connect with you? Where can we find you online?
Well, you find me online in www.suseweisse.de, which is my website.
Brilliant. Well, it's been great talking to you today, Suse. Thank you very much for talking to us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Speak to you again soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Rule the World. Be sure to rate, review and subscribe to the show, and visit weareopusmedia.com for more resources based on today's topic, as well as access to more episodes that will help you develop your storytelling abilities. That's weareopusmedia.com. Thank you, and see you next time.